to be able to show some of the videos here that are embedded in the presentation. We may stop and give you a chance to watch parts of them on your own in the process. So theater of the absurd is what we are moving into. It is a subgenre of drama as a whole. It is a very different approach to things. It is a 20th century art form. And so to begin, we're going to look at some influences that come from the artistic world. So take a look. Anybody familiar with the painting or the work? Huh? Not this one. Anybody familiar with the style? Huh? It should. It is Picasso. It's one of his Cubist works. So you notice the kind of geometric shapes. This one is known as the Three Musicians. Can you see all three? As well as their instruments? But you notice as you start to look, you're like, oh, it's just kind of funky. They sort of mix into each other. Can you see the dog? Because likely you can see his tail if you look down on the floor. And so when we look here, some of these early artistic works are good to start to get the concepts of what we're going to be seeing. They influenced because there were influences on it, but they were also part of sort of the worldview at the time. Anybody familiar with this? No? This is M.C. Escher, The Infinite Staircases. So, of course, the question becomes, which way is up? And the best answer to that is, it's dependent on which staircase you're on. You know, all of them are oriented appropriately for their own perspective. Of course, Escher kind of challenged those views of form and how he put things together in works like this as well. Anybody familiar with this one? Who is it?
I don't remember.
Oh, no? But you've seen it? Yeah. So this is Salvador Dali. He is one of the surrealists. Of course, his Melting Clocks is one of his more famous works, but he has lots of really abstract and different perspectives on the world, like his Burning Giraffes. Or his elephants. Again, there's a little bit with all of this where you're like, it's so weird. This is more like fantasy. Could be viewed that way. But what we want to see is there are differing perspectives on reality that kind of challenge preconceived concepts. Of course, here, Magritte's The Lovers, René Magritte, a French painter, kind of fell into that surrealist, challenging, abstract kind of painting world here. And then, of course, his famous bit, anyone familiar enough with French? The French here at the bottom basically translates really roughly into, this is not a pipe. But it is a pipe. But it's being asserted that it's not a pipe. And of course, you gotta love his trains. All of these different perspectives on how to kind of view. It was just working. So if this was working better, you might have caught it when we flipped the screen. We weren't going to play it because of a copyright strike, but here, think about Looney Tunes cartoons, and especially think about Roadrunner cartoons. What are ways that it portrays reality in a different concept? The what?
Does it the endless one? I don't remember.
In the Roadrunner ones, they don't.
Okay.
Yeah. If you can think back to those Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote cartoons, how they run. You see their legs usually cycle in a circle and smoke come out, dust being spooled, but even how motion comes about. They might run off a cliff and they just kind of stop and hang there for a second before they drop. And so the laws of physics often don't work in quite the right way. Think about how Wile E. Coyote tries to capture or kill the Roadrunner in practically every one of their cartoons. Are any of them realistic? They're normally overly elaborate traps or tricks that rely on huge bombs or some kind of device to inflict pain. But do they ever work out the way that he wants them to? No. Usually it comes back at him. And so if you look, this view of the world, though cartoonish, we're changing the way that we normally see reality, kind of like the paintings. And so we were taking something more abstract that you might not be familiar with, but comparing it to something that most everybody is familiar with a Roadrunner cartoon. And using both of these as a way to kind of introduce the heck we are talking about here when we talk about the theater of the absurd. We have to understand that the title of the genre only comes about years later, and that the kind of ideals of the genre that we see presented in these plays is not something that someone sat down and said, you know what, here's the type of story I want to tell. Instead, these plays are produced over time, and only later do we notice that similar artists are working in similar ways. It is similar to art or music, where someone doesn't create a genre or someone doesn't create a style. But instead, we notice that one person might step out and start to change things, and others are influenced by them. And we see this concept kind of develop out from there. We can kind of put our finger to the beginning of the thinking of the style to a 1942 article written by Albert Camus. He is a Frenchman. Camus writes this essay titled The Myth of Sisyphus. Anyone familiar with who Sisyphus is? Yes, he is. Does come from mythology. So Sisyphus is a figure that in the afterlife is punished by having to roll a boulder up a hill. And right as he gets it just about to the top of the hill, the boulder goes right back down every time. He can't complete his task. Camus uses this ideal of punishment and this idea of Sisyphus to relate to our modern life. That, you know what, it seems like in our modern way of living, we almost get to an answer and everything just falls apart. And he used it as a way to basically say in the essay that humanity has to resign itself to recognizing that a fully satisfying, rational explanation of the universe is simply beyond our reach. He's not saying that there is not an answer, but he said that our capacity for understanding is going to stop us from getting to the answer that we want. And we have to now resign ourselves to that recognition. We're never going to reach that fully satisfied concept. Now look at when he's writing this, 1942, and he's a European. So tell me some of the things that are influencing his thinking that kind of come about in the 20th century. World War II is right there. What else? If he's a Frenchman, we can't ignore World War I and the influence that now you're living under the kind of era of a double war that has happened in such close proximity. I think we also can't ignore, especially given the time that we're living in now, 1918 and the Spanish flu epidemic that goes around. We have lots of things that happen in these early parts of the 20th century, not to mention even think about the leaps and bounds bits of progress that happened by 1942 just for humanity. The telephone, the airplane, the automobile, bless you. These things that fundamentally change the ways that we live, the way that science has jumped forward. And we notice that as that 20th century starts to come on, so comes on this growing cynicism in our culture as a human being. Here he presents it. We are like Sisyphus. Regardless of how hard we work, that understanding of the meaning behind the universe, why things are the way they are, we're never going to fully get there. By 1962, notice the difference. 20 years later, Michael Aslin, who's a critic, writes a book on the theater of the absurd and uses Camus' essay as a way to say, hey, this same idea is expressed within a bunch of plays and different art that all kind of are articulating this idea that Camus put forward. That, you know what, we have to kind of understand that we live in a world that we can't understand, and we're not going to have a full idea of what's going on. And this is where this theater of the absurd concept comes from. And again, it comes from some big changes that are happening. We said the 2 world wars, but we also have to think about the move in the 20th century away from communal living towards individualism. We have talked about how in the 20th century, people began to have jobs rather than lifestyles. No longer could you be the blacksmith's son anymore. Now you have the opportunity to be whatever you wanted to be. And a job gives you free time to think. But all of these pieces insulate us into the individual. No longer are we having to rely on the people around us. We can just be self-sustaining. And we also have the rise beyond the technological jumps of psychology. We're beginning to understand how the brain works, how we form personalities, how we make connections. And so with these jumps, we assume, well, we should be able to figure these things out. But you have Camus that's there and others that are saying not so fast. When we look at what we're going to be seeing in these works, we're going to see a rejection of traditional forms of art. Think back to the paintings that we started with. Think back to the 3 musicians. Could you tell those 3 figures apart as distinct people? Yeah, not exactly. Sometimes, but not always. We reject those traditional forms of art. We want to shock the audience. We want to force people to question those conventional values that they had so that they start to think the ways that Camus and some of these others are starting to see things. And so it starts to come about in these plays, one of which is what we are going to read over the next few weeks. Here's my cursor. So we have to understand that the whole point of the genre that develops is to show a sense of the senselessness of the human condition and the inadequacy of the rational approach by the open abandonment of rational devices and discursive thought. So break it apart with me. Are there things that we do that don't make sense? Are there senseless things that we do as part of our existence?
Food manners.
What?
Manners, like at the table.
Oh, yeah. Social grace and manners. Can you give me an example?
Like chewing with
Chewing with your mouth closed. How many of you have been yelled at for that? And wondered, who cares? Why does it matter? Anything else that sticks out to you when you see this phrase, a sense of the senselessness of the human condition? What are other things that we do that are just senseless? How about worrying? Whether that's anxiety or whether that's an anxiousness or just worrying over a topic, letting yourself perseverate over what's going to happen and how things are going to play out and what's going to be the, is there any kind of a sensible reason why we do it? There's not a benefit. We're nervous. We're trying to just work through our own brain. But how many times do you sit there and you put all this energy into it, and then once you're past it, you start to go, wow, what was the point of that? Why did I get myself so worked up? It was nothing. There is that little bit. Now, am I trying to say that you are senseless if you suffer from those things? No, no, no. But think about how, when we look at it, this genre is trying to show what are things that we do that just, they don't make sense. When we put logical thought to it, it's like, what are we doing? How many times do we think about someone else's reaction? How many times do we wonder why things happened in our lives? And we know that there's no answer to it. We know that we're never going to figure out why that happened. Why did our pipe have to burst the other week? Or why did my car have to get hit in the parking lot? Why did I get that tip? Why did that cop pay attention to me while I was driving? Are we ever going to get an answer? But we want to put our time there. And Theater of the Absurd wants to push these things further because they want to talk about the inadequacy of the rational approach by abandoning rational devices and discursive thoughts. So if we want to show truly what are the things that we do in life that are senseless, we do it by showing on stage how the thoughts that we use are never going to get us there. And we're going to abandon those things as well. We're going to let these kind of people exist and kind of point out what they're doing that doesn't work. When we talk about the theater of the absurd, we have to understand that here, when we're talking about absurd, it's that which is devoid of purpose. So think about man. We all are driven by a purpose. We all want to do things for some reason. Well, imagine if we were cut off from what gives us purpose. Our religious, metaphysical, and our transcendental roots. If we're cut off from that, why do we do the things that we do? Well, here it says that's where we get to it, because without those things, man is lost. His actions become senseless, absurd, and useless. Ready? Why do we come to school? Why?
Because one day some person just said, let's form a society. And now we have us to go to school and go to work plans.
Exactly, right? Think about, like, I know this is going a little bit far, but this is part of our purpose. This year has shown us more than ever why we go to school and what we're doing, because there definitely is that bit where you're like, this whole thing is propagated just on this idea of, hey, we say that you need a certain level of education to exist in our society. Consider something like literacy, right? Being able to read and write. Widespread societal literacy is a thing that is less than a century old. When you really consider it, the expectation that everybody in our society should be able to read and write is less than 100 years old. And if you're like, is it? There's a really good article that you can find that talked about what schools did in the 1911 pandemic. How did schools function during 1911? And in the article, they basically have to say, well, schools weren't the same way. Students weren't required to be here. There was no such thing as compulsory attendance. If you didn't come to school, you didn't come to school. Nobody was really worried about where you were. There was no expectation that you had to read and write. There was no expectation that you graduate from high school. You got what education you could, and then when you hit that point that you couldn't come to school anymore, you went to work. That's it. But now we have built these things to it. And so notice here, seemingly, there is a purpose behind it. We want to educate. We think that there's a value in education. We hold those pieces. But if we take some of those things away, think about that kid that you've probably experienced that comes to school every day and does nothing. They don't turn in their work. They don't engage. They don't answer questions. They just kind of sit there. And the teacher might ask them that question, why do you come to school? What are you doing? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I have to. That kid is cut off from any of these reasons that might drive his purpose for coming here. And so you know what? In this definition, he is lost because he doesn't understand what's going on there. And by showing this, he seems absurd to our perspective because we do have that. We know why we're here. We know what we want. These works try to show that beyond even school, beyond these things, if we live in a world that we have to understand we can't get a reasonable explanation for, then why are we doing anything? What's our purpose in any of it? And that's what these guys were trying to get to. So if we look at a little more of this, hey, where are we going and what are we looking at? If we had to provide a definition for what do we mean by the theater of the absurd? We show the failure of man, but we don't recommend a solution. So we point out these things that don't work. Let's go back to our friend that comes to school, who doesn't do anything, who doesn't understand why he's here. Do we have a really good answer in our system for what he's supposed to do? Because do we want him to drop out? Not really. We hope at some point he figures out the value of the education in front of him. But, we don't have a clear path. And so, unfortunately, we might point out like, wow, he's stuck. But we don't have an answer. Consider how many times you might recognize a problem in life, but hey, nobody's going to give you an easy solution for how to fix it. Let's change this up because we got really serious. Think about comedians. Comedians live completely in this world. They like to point out things that don't work, but they're not going to give you an answer for, and here's how we fix it. They're just going to laugh about the ridiculousness of it. Think about, do the bathrooms that we have, do they have actual, can you pull the faucets? They don't have the little the motion sensor? Okay. How many of you hate those motion sensor bathroom faucets? Because, how hard are they to use? How many times do you have to move your hand up and down to figure out where your hand has to be to get it to turn on? I feel like an idiot when I use them because it's like, regardless, I'll put my hands in and it's like, there we go. Got it. Takes forever. Why don't they just put the handles on there? Do they think we're going to stop up all those faucets and just run the water and run out? No. Think about comedians like to point out these things. Jerry Seinfeld built a whole bit around faucets at the airport with those hand motion sensors. Whole thing. But did he try to solve the problem? Nope. Just pointed it out, made people laugh. Theater of the Absurd is going to do the same thing. We're going to present these things that they don't make sense. We don't understand why we're doing it, but the purpose of the work isn't to solve it, but instead to show the failure of the system. We're going to see this absurd take form in man's reaction to a world that doesn't have meaning. We're going to present man as a puppet who is controlled or menaced by some outside invisible force. Do you ever feel like a puppet at the whim of many other people and you don't always have your own personal agency? You should. Oh my gosh. Consider what we just said about school. Even though you might see a purpose to it, even though you might understand education and you might have your path forward, do you always feel like you are 100% in control of everything? Heck no. We could get a winter storm that comes through and all of a sudden we're gone from school for a week. You come back and some teacher isn't understanding and they're just like, hey, guess what? 2 weeks worth of work. Pow! Catch up. We want to show in these works that our world doesn't make sense. And that a lot of times we're just kind of here trying to figure stuff out. We're going to show these ideas through things like absence or emptiness, nothingness, or unresolved mysteries to be able to show this concept that we don't know, but we still have to exist even though we don't know. In what we're going to read over the next 2 weeks, we're going to see two guys that exist in this place that doesn't have a whole lot of characteristics, and they know what they're there for, but they really don't know why they're there. They're waiting for a guy, but they don't know why they're waiting for him. They just know that's what they do. When we look at theater of the absurd, I put a short little work here, but again, I want to avoid a copyright strike. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to see. We're going to see a play that has 2 acts. And there's a reason why it has 2 acts, because it takes place over 2 days. But there's not going to be a logical progression of what happens in this play. There's no story. There are very few realistic occurrences that happen. We're not going to have traditional character development. These guys are going to be there, and they're not going to learn or grow or do. They're just going to be there. Instead, we're going to focus on these 2 guys being trapped in this situation that is incomprehensible to them. That they are subject to whatever happens around them, no matter how illogical. And there will be things that happen that are completely illogical. We're going to couple it with an inadequacy of language to form meaningful human connections. How many times does this one frustrate you? That at times you can put your words together to express your truth, but it doesn't make sense to the person that you most want it to. Or the words that you do come up with are completely inadequate to explaining how you feel or what you think. And it frustrates you because the words are all that you have. We're going to see characters struggle with this. And at times it's going to be almost, you're going to want to laugh because it's so stupid. Because you're just going to be like, what are they doing? Like, this is nonsense. But they're trying to express as best as they can what they think and what they feel, but it doesn't work. And so rather than, we've spent so much time trying to figure out how do we use language to build those experiences, we're going to break it now. There are 2 prominent ideals we're going to lean on very heavily, because so far all that I've talked about is, hey, these works don't make a lot of sense. And they want to express what doesn't work in the world, but they're not going to give you answers. And so you might be sitting there like, then how am I supposed to be able to study this? We're going to lean on 2 ideals to do so. Both of them kind of come from a more psychological, more philosophical place, but they're real simple in how we're going to apply them. One is existentialism. Anybody heard the phrase before? Vague understanding of it, but if somebody said, hey, well, what's the definition? You're like, I don't know that I can define it. So let's start with existentialism. Existentialism as a whole deals with conditions and definitions of existence of an individual. So that's a big thing. Existentialism deals with one, an individual. Their emotions, their actions, their responsibilities, and their thoughts. Existentialism as a concept has kind of developed from the thinking of Camus and some of these early 20th century thinkers that started to express that we live in a world where meaning appears to have disappeared. Consider that if you lived before the 20th century, you likely lived in a country that mostly followed one religion. Maybe not one sect, but one religious faith, whether that's Christianity, whether that's Islam, whether that's any of the other, Buddhism, what have you. Usually that religion guided a people and seemed to provide answers. But as we've moved into the 20th century, not only have we mixed those cultures together, but our understandings of science and psychology and progress have started to bring those religious beliefs into question. And so what used to unite people in understandings of meanings, now that meaning has seemingly disappeared. And so rather than focusing on that exterior meaning, we focus on the individual. And we say that in existentialism, the individual is responsible for giving life meaning in spite of the existential obstacles and distractions that exist. Consider If you are supposed to figure out what is most important to you, would something like angst get in your way? If you're worried about what other people think about what you believe, is it going to strengthen what you believe? No. If you're feeling a sense of boredom, and that boredom comes about because of what you enjoy doing, are you finding what's true for you? So existentialism says that these things exist in the world to distract us from figuring out ultimately what is most important to us, and that the meaning must be defined by us. Now you might be looking at that and being like, so everyone has their own meaning. Yep. According to this, everyone does. It doesn't mean that there's, doesn't mean that meanings are wrong as much as there's no central meaning that exists anymore. When there's that question that's posed, what's the meaning of life? Existentialism says you decide that. It is not an objective question, it is rather a subjective thing that we need to study. Everybody follow me? So when we look here at existential thinking, Kierkegaard is a philosopher that you might have heard batted around before. It might be a name that you're like, okay, got it. Just look right here in bold. Kierkegaard said, the thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which I can live and die. That ultimately is what drives a human being. And so that might be provided by religion, and it might be provided in a religion that you were birthed into and raised in, and that's perfectly legitimate. We're not getting you to question anything here, as much as to say, according to our thinkers, existentialism says there is no one central meaning, and instead it is up to you to determine that which fulfills you. So as we look at our connection to the absurd, we're going to understand that in these works, there is no meaning found in the world beyond what meaning we give to it. It includes unfairness and amorality. So consider morality for a second. Morality is usually defined by our society as well as by our religion. But if we do that, then it has to be common. It has to be the same for all. It's why we often get frustrated with moralistic thinking, because we assume everyone in a society believes in similar things. But here, if we follow this existentialism thing, we have to understand, no, morality doesn't exist because morality is individual. Same thing as fairness. As a kid, you probably got super frustrated because you were like, that's not fair. Rather than understanding fairness isn't about applying it to all. Fairness is about considering the one and applying it just there, as far as an existentialist would think. This is going to give us our way in to basically say, in these works, we are going to find things that are meaningful. And analysis says that as long as we can use the work to support our thinking, we are correct. From the existentialist perspective, these works are going to challenge us and force us to rationalize what we are thinking and what we are seeing. And as long as we can do that, we are correct. These works want to get you to start to think about what they are presenting that is true for you. And they're going to challenge you to come to your own conclusions. And we will see that starting tomorrow. Because I guarantee you, some of you are going to get really frustrated really quick, because you're going to be like, oh my God, these two are just talking about nothing. Yet for someone else in the room, the conversation that is seemingly about nothing will be very meaningful. Let's go on and talk a little bit about, why not? Let's talk about Sartre, another French philosopher. Here we have a quote: good is only an illusion. Evil is a nothingness which arises upon the ruin of good. And how many of you are like, ugh, I don't like that. Good's an illusion and evil's nothing. Ugh. Notice that again, it's challenging that existential concept. What is good for you doesn't necessarily have to be good for someone else. It's an illusion. It's something we create. Our second concept is one that students tend to like a little bit more. Existentialism gives you that acknowledgement that, hey, you can be right because it's true for you. But they like this because we tend to be a lot more cynical. And nihilism plays into that. Nihilistic thinking basically suggests the negation of a meaningful aspect of life. So to be a nihilist as a whole is simply to say that there is no positives in life. Everything sucks. But you can tag it with a specific branch. So you could be an existential nihilist, for example, and you can say that life has no meaning. If existentialism says you have to figure it out, existential nihilism says, oh, there is none. There's not that. You think you can find meaning? No, it doesn't exist, pal. Often, nihilistic thinking is used to explain a mood of despair at a perceived pointlessness of existence that one may develop upon realizing that there are no necessary norms, rules, or laws. Consider, why do we stop at stop signs? For the safety of others. Why do you stop at stop signs if there's no one else in the intersection? Huh?
The fear of being caught.
Bingo. There's that fear of being caught. But do you have to? You ever drive up to a four-way stop and see somebody just blow through it and you're further away and it just irks you because you're like, I'm going to stop, and they just blew through it. I can't believe it. They're not going to get punished. We know that feeling. And nihilism kind of taps into this, that once we start to figure out what's the point of it? What are we doing? That's where this nihilism creeps in. And so it really gets to this feeling of cynical negativity. If you really want to see it, again, I don't want the copyright strike on the video. Go back and rewatch this hospital scene from The Dark Knight, if you've ever seen it, where the Joker talks about being a dog chasing cars. And he talks about all these things, and you're going to start to see, oh my gosh, this is nihilism at work. He's negating everything. He's going against it. Holy crap. So what we are going to get to as we start tomorrow is a genre that is going to ask you to draw your own conclusions. At the same time, it's going to expect you to make your own mistakes and errors. And so this is where the thinking part of this class comes in. We've trained on how to analyze text. Now we're going to throw something at you that's really going to force you to draw an opinion, to make a statement. And it's not necessarily always going to validate your statement to say, you know what, we can guarantee that you're right. It's going to instead keep saying, how do you know you're right? How is this further developed in here? How do we get this? So we do have just some things that we want to keep in mind. These are the end of the notes. That as we look, we're going to see things that are broadly comedic, mixed with horrific or tragic imagery sometimes. Kind of darker humor. We're going to see characters that are caught in hopeless situations and forced to do repetitive or meaningless actions time and time again, and they don't understand what they're doing either. We're going to see dialogue that's full of cliches, wordplay, and sometimes just downright nonsense. They'll say things, you'll look at me, and I'll just have to shrug my shoulders. I don't know either. The plots are often cyclical, or they're just absurdly expansive. They just keep going with no perceived end. We sometimes create parodies of well-made works or of realistic situations to be able to point out the absurdity of what we do. We often have an outside force that is present but absent. We will see that. As we start tomorrow, we will hear all about Godot, but Godot isn't there. These characters are often flat. They won't develop, we said. And, they'll often be here in pairs. So tomorrow we will meet Vladimir and Estragon, the two main characters of the work. They will be stuck in this situation, and together they will try to figure out what they can understand about it.